Tutankhamun, burned inside his own coffin. Autumn, 1925. A burial chamber cut into the limestone of the Valley of the Kings, sealed shut for more than 3,000 years. Howard Carter and his team have spent 3 seasons working their way down through the gold. The shrines, the stone sarcophagus, the 3 nested coffins. And now they have finally reached the boy at the center of all of it. The king the entire world has been waiting to see. Tutankhamun. He is not the golden child of the photographs. He is carbonized. The linen wrappings and the flesh beneath them are charred and blackened, fused into a hard, pitch-like mass, cemented so violently into the bottom of his own coffin that no force the team can safely apply will lift him free. And here is the part the curse stories never tell you. Carter's own chemist, a man named Alfred Lucas, studies the damage, and he writes down a phrase that should have rewritten everything we believe about this tomb. He calls it a kind of slow, spontaneous combustion. The body, he suspects, cooked itself in the dark in 1925. And then, for the better part of a century, almost no one asked the obvious question. Whether that fire happened on the embalming table or after the coffin lid was sealed shut is a fight that still splits Egyptology today. To understand how a pharaoh ends up burned inside his own tomb, we have to follow 3 things. Something close to 2 buckets full of black oil poured over a corpse. A royal burial done in such a hurry that the paint was still wet on the walls. And a king who went into eternity, missing his own heart. We will also get to why one team of investigators believes he was run down on a battlefield, and why others say that idea is nonsense. So let us start where Carter started, with a body that would not come out of its box. When Carter first broke through into the tomb, designated KV-62 on the 4th of November, 1922, the world lost its mind. On the 26th of November, 1922, he made the first entry through the sealed doorway, and behind it sat the only royal burial in Egypt ever found, with most of its treasure still in place. We followed one part of that story in an earlier investigation, the sealed room that sits behind the north wall of this very chamber, the room Egypt has never agreed to open. But the wall was never the strangest thing in this tomb. The strangest thing was the body. It took Carter 3 more years to reach it. The unwrapping began on the 11th of November, 1925, and almost at once the team understood that something had gone wrong inside the coffin. The mummy was black. Not the deep brown of ordinary Egyptian resin, but blackened and brittle, the tissue carbonized, as though it had been scorched from the inside. The cause was sitting right there in the coffin with him. The embalmers had drenched the body in dark, anointing oils, the ritual unguents poured over royal dead. But on Tutankhamun, they had not been careful. They had been extravagant. Carter estimated that something close to 2 buckets full of these oils had been emptied over the king, soaking the wrappings from shoulder to foot. They spared only 2 things: the solid gold mask over his face and the very tips of his feet. Those oils had set like cement. Over 3,000 years they hardened into a black, resinous rock that bonded the body to the gold beneath it. Carter wrote that no amount of legitimate force could free the king from the coffin. His team tried leaving the coffins out in the open air of the valley, where the midday sun pushed the surface temperature to around 150 degrees Fahrenheit, hoping the heat would soften the mass. It did not. In the end, they resorted to heated knives, cutting the king out piece by piece. And it was while studying that blackened, oil-soaked rock that Carter's chemist reached for his now famous phrase. Alfred Lucas, the analytical chemist attached to the clearance, described the carbonization as a kind of slow, spontaneous combustion. We should be precise about the attribution here, because it matters for getting this right. The phrase appears in Carter's 1927 volume on the tomb, but it reflects the chemical diagnosis of Lucas, the man whose job was to understand what these substances actually were. He was not describing a curse. He was describing a reaction. The question is, what reaction? To answer it, we have to leave the tomb for a moment and look at what poured-on oil actually does in the dark, because the science of it is stranger than any legend. The oils the embalmers used were plant oils, the kind chemists call drying oils. Linseed oil is the classic example, the same family of oil that painters and woodworkers have relied on for centuries. And drying oils have a hidden property. They do not simply sit there. They react with the air. The process has a name: autoxidation. The molecules in these oils contain what chemists call unsaturated bonds, weak points in the fatty acid chains where the structure is doubled up and vulnerable. Oxygen from the air attacks those weak points. It forms unstable compounds called peroxide, and that reaction gives off heat. On its own, on an open surface, the heat escapes into the room and nothing happens. But trap it, and everything changes. Picture oil-soaked cloth, packed tight, with no way for the heat to escape. The reaction warms the cloth. The warmth speeds up the reaction. The faster reaction makes more heat. It is a loop that feeds itself, and in the right conditions it climbs all the way to the point of smoldering, with no spark, no match, no open flame of any kind. Fire investigators have understood this hazard for the better part of 2 centuries. It is why a pile of rags soaked in linseed oil is treated as a genuine fire risk, and why those rags are stored in sealed metal containers. The oily rag that bursts into flame in an empty room is not a myth. It is chemistry. Now lay that over Tutankhamun, a body wrapped in layer after layer of linen. Those layers soaked with something close to 2 buckets full of plant-based oils, sealed inside a coffin, inside a sarcophagus, inside a hot tomb in the Egyptian desert. Every single ingredient a fire investigator would point to is present in that coffin. And consider also the embalming process that preceded it. The priests had packed the body cavity with natron, the salt compound the Egyptians used to dry and preserve flesh, before those oils were poured. Natron, oils, linen, heat, sealed darkness. The chemistry was already primed. Now we owe you the honest weakness in this story, because a channel that only tells you the exciting half is not worth your evening. A sealed coffin is not an open room. It is closed, and a closed space starves a fire of oxygen, which is the one thing this reaction needs to keep climbing. A runaway blaze, hot enough to fully cremate a body, is very hard to sustain inside a shut box. National Geographic, reviewing the most dramatic version of this theory, noted that a modern crematorium runs far hotter than the temperature some have proposed for the inside of this coffin. That specific figure, often quoted at around 400 degrees Fahrenheit, and the larger story attached to it, did not come from a peer-reviewed journal. They came from a television documentary, and we will name it shortly. So we hold the line carefully here. The carbonization is real and documented. The exact mechanism is still argued. There is one piece of physical evidence that pushed this from curiosity into genuine debate. For that documentary, the anatomist Robert Connolly of the University of Liverpool, who had kept tissue samples from an earlier examination of the king, placed those samples under an electron microscope and reported chemical signs consistent with burning in the body itself. That is the thread that turned a quiet phrase from 1925 into a modern argument. If you have read this far with us, taking a famous mystery apart with real chemistry instead of recycled rumor, that is exactly what we do here every couple of days. Subscribing is the single thing that tells the algorithm to bring you the next investigation, So if this is your kind of evening, make it official before we go further. Because the chemistry inside the coffin only matters if the burial around it was already strange. And Tutankhamun's burial was provably strange. He was put into the ground in a hurry, in the wrong kind of tomb, and missing something no pharaoh should ever be without. Start with the walls. For decades, visitors to this tomb have noticed strange brown spots scattered across the painted plaster, blemishes that appear in no other royal tomb in the valley. In 2011, a team led by the Harvard microbiologist Ralph Mitchell examined them. The spots they found were biological. They were the dead residue of fungal and bacterial growth, dark pigments called melanins, left behind by microbes that had bloomed and then died on the walls. And microbes bloom on a wall for one reason: moisture. The paint had not been dry when the chamber was sealed. The most likely explanation is that the king was buried so quickly that the tomb was closed before the plaster had a chance to cure. That fits everything else about this burial. Tutankhamun ruled a great empire, yet he was laid to rest in a small tomb, cramped and oddly proportioned for a king. The kind of tomb that looks as though it was meant for someone else and pressed into service at short notice. Something about the end of this reign was rushed. Part of what made the rush comprehensible was the chaos Tutankhamun had inherited. His father, the pharaoh Akhenaten, had upended Egyptian religion entirely, erasing the old gods in favor of a single deity. Tutankhamun spent his short reign trying to restore order. There may have been no time to build a proper tomb. And then there is the body itself, and what is no longer in it. When the anatomists Ronald Harrison and Ahmed Abdallah of the University of Liverpool published their study of the remains in 1972, they confirmed something extraordinary. Tutankhamun's chest is wrecked. His breastbone is gone. Many of the ribs across the front of his torso are missing entirely, cut away. And his heart, the single organ the ancient Egyptians believed a person needed above all others to pass into the afterlife, the organ they deliberately left inside the body or replaced with a sacred scarab, is absent. For a royal mummy, that is almost unheard of. The Egyptians removed the lungs, the stomach, the liver, and the intestines, and sealed them in the canopic jars that sat in a separate gilded shrine within the tomb. The heart they left behind, because the heart was weighed in the next world against the feather of truth, a judgment described in the spells of the Book of the Dead that every royal burial was meant to navigate. Tutankhamun was sent into that judgment without one. The priests of Anubis, the god who presided over embalming and the passage into the underworld, would have understood exactly what that absence meant. Here the mystery deepens rather than resolves, because the chest was not always empty. Photographs taken by Harry Burton, the expedition's photographer, in the years right after the discovery, show a beaded collar lying over an intact chest. The ribs and the breastbone were still there in the 1920s. They vanished at some point afterward. Researchers have offered 4 competing explanations: that the bones were removed during a modern effort to recover that valuable beaded collar, that they were stolen during the upheaval of the Second World War, that the damage was ancient, the mark of some catastrophic injury at the moment of death, or that the embalmers themselves cut the chest away in antiquity to hide a wound they could not otherwise disguise. There is as yet no agreement on which is true. It was this wrecked, hollowed body that produced the single most famous theory about Tutankhamun, the idea that gripped the public imagination for almost 40 years. In 1968, the same Professor Harrison of Liverpool brought an X-ray machine into the tomb and took the first radiographs of the king. And in the images of the skull, he saw something: a loose fragment of bone drifting inside the cranium, and a thin area at the base of the skull. Harrison raised the possibility, carefully, that the king might have been struck on the back of the head. The press did not hear the caution. It heard murder. The boy king, assassinated by a blow to the head, became one of the most repeated stories in all of archaeology. That single X-ray sent the world hunting for a killer for almost 4 decades. And then, in the early 2000s, a different machine was wheeled up to the tomb, and it proved every one of those hunters wrong. In 2005, the Egyptian Mummy Project, directed by Zahi Hawass, lifted Tutankhamun's body out of his coffin and slid it into a portable computed tomography scanner parked in a trailer beside the tomb. In a session lasting roughly 15 minutes, the machine captured around 1,700 individual cross-sectional images of the king, a level of detail no X-ray could ever reach. The radiologist Ashraf Salim examined the skull, and the murder theory collapsed. That loose fragment of bone inside the head was not the trace of a fatal blow. It was unembedded in the surrounding resin, which meant it had broken loose after death, not during life. If it had been there at the moment of embalming, it would have been cemented in place by the resins poured into the skull. It was floating free instead. Salim traced it to the first cervical vertebra and the upper neck, bone that had most likely been snapped not by an assassin 3,000 years ago, but by Carter's own men in 1925, as they wrenched the gold mask away from a body fused solid with hardened oil. The blow to the head was never a blow at all. It was the excavation itself. So what did kill him? In 2010, Hawass and a team of geneticists and radiologists published their findings in the Journal of the American Medical Association under the title Ancestry and Pathology in King Tutankhamun's Family, and the picture they assembled was of a young man who was anything but unhealthy. They recovered the DNA of Plasmodium falciparum, the parasite that causes the deadliest form of malaria, among the oldest genetic evidence of the disease ever found in precisely dated remains. They found avascular bone necrosis, a condition in which bone tissue dies from a loss of blood supply. They found a club foot, a deformity in his left foot that would have forced him to walk on its edge. And they found a fractured left thigh bone, a break that may have come shortly before death. Suddenly, an odd detail from the tomb made sense. Among the treasures, Carter had found roughly 130 walking sticks and staves. He had joked that the king must simply have collected them. The bones told a different story. A young man with a deformed foot and dying bone tissue did not collect walking sticks. He leaned on them. He needed them to cross a room. Those sticks now sit among the artifacts in the Grand Egyptian Museum, the vast complex near Cairo that houses the treasures from K-Fiv 62, and they remain among the most quietly devastating objects in the entire collection. Which brings us back to the fire. Because none of this medical detail settles the question Alfred Lucas raised in 1925. It only sharpens it. We now have a body that was rushed into the ground, drenched in oils, sealed wet into the dark, and found burned black. And the people who study it most closely still cannot agree on when the burning happened. On one side stand the researchers behind the modern combustion argument, the Egyptologist Chris Naunton, who fronted a 2013 investigation broadcast on Channel 4 in Britain, and the Liverpool anatomist Robert Connolly. Their case is that the chemical reaction in those oils began after the coffin was sealed, that Tutankhamun smoldered in the dark by accident, a botched burial that quite literally caught fire. It is from that documentary, and not from any journal, that the most dramatic claims flow: the proposed temperature of the fire, and a separate, vivid theory that the king's crushed chest came from being run down by a chariot, a scenario the program tested by driving a metal bar into a rack of pig ribs at the speed of a chariot wheel. These are documentary claims. We mark them clearly as such. On the other side stands one of the most respected voices in the field, Salima Ikram, professor of Egyptology at the American University in Cairo. She argues that there may be no accident here at all. The blackened, resin-drenched body, she suggests, was a deliberate act, an attempt to make the dead king resemble Osiris, the black-skinned god of the underworld and resurrection. What looks to modern eyes like a mummification gone catastrophically wrong may have been, to the priests who performed it, exactly right. The darkness was the point. We cannot tell you which of them is correct, because no one yet can. And that is where we have to leave him. Think about what this body has endured. It has been X-rayed, scanned, sampled, sequenced, and argued over by more scientists than almost any human being who has ever lived. We have read its malaria in its DNA and counted the walking sticks it leaned on. And still, standing over the most examined corpse in the history of the world, we cannot answer the one question Carter's Chemist asked first, in that quiet, careful phrase, in 1925. We cannot say whether the fire came before the lid closed, or after. The boy king burned in the dark of his own coffin, and the dark has not finished keeping its secret.